Hello and welcome. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the Cross Washington mountain biking route. I did this route in September of 2023, and one of the things I'm always looking for when I'm looking at a new route is the logistics surrounding the route. How to get there, where to stay, how much it costs, things like that. So I will go over all of those things regarding the Cross Washington mountain biking route. Also, this was one of my first long distance bikepacking trips. And I also learned a lot being a new bike packer, so I will go over those things a little bit as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kyria. I have been bikepacking around the US and Canada for the last 8 months, but the Cross Washington mountain biking route was my first bikepacking journey over 2 days. So I learned a lot about myself, about bikepacking, but also had a really good time on this route itself. Just a quick disclaimer, I did not complete the route exactly how it was meant to be completed. So I did, in the end, run out of time and had to do a little bit of an alternative route for a couple of the sections. So I can't tell you exactly everything about the route, but I will give you some information about the logistics of the route, as well as my favorite parts of the route, my least favorite parts of the route, and what I learned as a bike packer. At the very end, I also have a few tips that I've learned as a backpacker that I also use for bikepacking that I think are very helpful for either sport. So follow along here as I walk and talk. Let's get started. Logistics. The first thing I always look at is how to get to the place I'm going. So the Cross Washington mountain bike route is a point-to-point, which does make it a little bit more difficult for getting to the start and the finish, or getting to the start and from the finish. So most people go on a eastward direction, which is what I did. It starts in La Push, Washington, which is right on the coast in the Olympic Peninsula. And it's kind of a small town, and so it is a little bit hard to get to. And then it ends at the border of Washington and Idaho near the town of Tekoa, which also is a very small town. And so for the beginning, I actually drove. So you can drive, or if you fly into Seattle, you can take a ferry from Seattle to Bainbridge Island. And from there, you can take a bus from Bainbridge Island to Port Angeles. And then there's another bus that goes from Port Angeles to Forks. And then you would have to ride to La Push. That's as of 2023, which is when I did this route. I did do all of that on my way back. So I took the ferry. It's very easy. You do have to pay, I think it's $10.50 for that direction. The ferries in Washington you only have to pay one way. So if you were going eastward, you wouldn't have to pay, but because you're going westward, you do have to pay. So the ferry ride is quite easy. And then after that, there is a bus that goes to Port Angeles that does hold bigger tires, and I did not have to take off all of my bags. I did have to take off any that were kind of bouncy or heavy, so I did take off my seat bag and my handlebar bag, but I left my frame bag on. From Port Angeles, I actually rode my bike back. So since I drove, I started near La Push, but when I finished, I did have to get back to my car. So I did all this to get back to my car. And I decided that since I actually had a little bit of extra time, that I would just ride my bike from Port Angeles back to where my car was parked, which was in between Forks and La Push. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, so I will start with, if you do drive, you can park with Bob. And I will put a link in the description, but Bob runs a little bit of a kind of party / campground, which is in between Forks and La Push, and he has a lot of space for parking. You can also camp there overnight if you need to stay the night before or the night after when you come back. And he's super nice. He accepts cash donations. And so I just paid him some cash once I came back and picked up my car. So you just park there. And he actually gave me a ride in the end to La Push in his vintage car, which I can't remember what it was. Ford, I think. He's probably going to kill me because if it's a Chevy, I think he's very much a Ford or a Chevy guy, but I can't remember which one it was. But he gave me a ride to La Push in his vintage car with my bike. So that was really nice of him. But if he's not around or not willing to do that, the ride from his place to La Push is not that far. After that, getting back from the end, like I said, if you do park at Bob's place, you will have to do exactly that same thing to get back to his place from Seattle. But to get to Seattle from Spokane, I took the Flixbus. It was about $50. And they do have a rack underneath the bus to hold your bike. You will still have to get to Spokane. So personally, I rode my bike, but I'm not sure what the other options are for that. So that's getting there and away. If you flew, you could technically fly into Seattle and out of Spokane, which would probably be the best way to do it if you're going to have to box your bike up anyway. For lodging and camping, most of the time you're going through places where you probably could get a motel if you wanted. So you could do this as almost a credit card trip if you wanted to. It really depends on how far you can go in one day. Because for me, I thought I was going to go approximately 50 to 70 miles per day. And some of the days were a little harder than I thought they were going to. So I wasn't able to get as far as I wanted to go. In this case, you may have some times when you would need to camp. For example, in the Olympic Peninsula, the towns that have motels are a little bit farther and fewer and farther between. So that is one area. And then once you get into the further eastern Washington area, you do have a lot of farmland. And so sometimes there's not really a town big enough to have a motel. However, out of the 14 days that I was on the road, and that includes my road trip, I stayed in a motel 7 times. So on the actual bikepacking route, that would be out of the 12 days, I stayed 6 times. So basically half the time I stayed in a motel. One of the other things I always like to look at is what is the highlights and lowlights of a specific route. So for me, the highlight was the Olympic Peninsula. It was very green, of course, and the Olympic Discovery Trail was really fun. There's either the bike trail section of it, which is pretty, and there's lots of bathrooms and it's very well built. And then there's the adventure portion of it, and that is really fun. It's not very long, but it's a really nice, flowy single track. And personally, at this time, I hadn't had really very much experience with single track. And this was probably the best single track I'd ever been on, even though those really tight turns in some of the sections were a little bit scary at first. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So let's talk about costs. Like I said, I drove from California up to Washington, and along that drive I did get a room for one night. And then it took me about 12 days to do the trip, and I did stay in Spokane one extra day in a motel, and then I came back and drove home and stayed with a friend on the way. So that's all included, but it obviously depends on whether or not you stay in motels or wild camp, because that is the biggest cost. The total cost for 14 days for this trip for me was $1,350. So an average per day for me for the 14 days I was on the road was about $96. Basically, of this total cost, about $640 of that was lodging. That also included $363 in transportation, which was comprised of $230 in gas, $63 for the bus from Spokane to Seattle, $10.45 for the ferry from Seattle to Bainbridge Island, $50 for parking, and $10 from the public bus from Bainbridge Island to Port Angeles. I also spent $176 on dining out, $159 on groceries, and $9 on shopping, which was a charging cord that broke when I was on the bus. Like I said before, I stayed in a motel 7 times. I also stayed with a friend once, wild camped 4 times, and stayed in the city park of a town twice. The hardest part of this trip for me, aside from being a new bikepacker and learning a few things along the way, which I will talk about in a minute, was some of the sections on eastern Washington were very dry and very hot, and there wasn't really any water. And a lot of the reports from the websites that I looked at said that the people of eastern Washington weren't very friendly, and they wouldn't give you water, and you shouldn't walk up to them and ask to use their hose. So I have to admit I was a little paranoid about talking to anyone. So I didn't. And a lot of the times I was basically rationing water in a very hot climate. And so that was probably the hardest thing. I don't know if I would do anything differently. I may go ask people for help, but because when I did get to a smaller town, they were very, very friendly. So I'm not really sure if a couple of people have had bad experience or what the situation is with that. so that's all I have to talk about the logistics of the Cross Washington for the moment, but I will talk a little bit for those who are interested about being a new bikepacker and what I learned on this trip about bikepacking. The first thing I learned, like I said, the single track was very twisty and turny, and I hadn't really had a lot of experience with that before. So figuring out how to turn sharply without falling over, especially with a heavily laden bike, was a little bit of a challenge, but I did kind of have it down by the end. One thing I didn't know, and I know you could probably watch a video about this and learn how to do this from that, but I just kind of learned this on my own, was that you should definitely have the pedal up on the side that you're turning into. So if I'm turning left, my left foot should be up and my right foot should be down, and that way you can lean into the corner a little bit. So that was something I learned the hard way, but definitely was helpful after I figured it out. The other thing, which is probably very obvious to people who do mountain biking already, was that if you're going to go down a long, bumpy downhill, you should just raise your butt up and keep your two pedals flat, and that way you're not hurting your butt while you're going down. The other thing I learned, which definitely took a little trial and error, was that I needed to be realistic about my mileage. I'm not going to lie, I'm having a little bit of a sufferfest here. So it's very common for me on backpacking, when I'm backpacking, to try to do a little bit too much. And usually with backpacking, I can do that. With bikepacking, I was able to most of the time do the amount that I wanted, but I think I kind of overestimated the amount of miles that I would do per day, especially since I had done some hills and some dirt, but the more hills and the more dirt and the rougher the terrain, the slower you're gonna go. And especially if you're doing a lot of hike-a-bike and pushing uphill, it can really take a long time. And you're mentally tired, and sometimes it's just nice to take a break or to stop earlier than, if you say you're going to do 70 miles and it turns out to be a lot of uphill pushing, it becomes a really long day really fast. So I think as a new bikepacker, I would suggest maybe underestimate your miles, and if you can go a little far, otherwise you're not always trying to do a lot. So I have a train going by, so hopefully it's not too loud. I'm going to keep going, and hopefully it's not too distracting, because I only have a couple more things. The other thing I learned was how to take my bike on public transportation. I'd never really taken my bike on a car ferry, and I hadn't really been on a long distance bus, and I had taken my road bike on a public bus before, but I hadn't ever taken my mountain bike, so I was kind of afraid that the tires weren't going to fit in the rack, and so it taught me a lot about that. And I do have a video about that, and I will link it here, or maybe here. And it talks all about what I've learned about taking my bike on various forms of transportation, and kind of some tips and tricks about that. The other thing that's a lot different than backpacking is the food. So when I'm backpacking, and I'm going to be backpacking for 7 days or 9 days, I carry 7 days or 9 days worth of food with me. And because a lot of times, in order to get food, if you're backpacking, you actually have to do extra miles to hike down to get to a town to resupply. With bikepacking, usually you're going through a town every day or maybe 2 days. And even when you're in remote places, you may pass a gas station or a small convenience store or some little restaurant, and you can at the very least, stock up on cheese sandwiches or whatever. So there's a lot more opportunities to get food. So I did the classic thing. I carried way too much food at the beginning, and I learned as I went that you really can just carry 1 day or 2 days, or maybe a few extra snacks for just in case, but you really don't need as much food for bikepacking as you do for backpacking. The last 3 things that I'm going to say are not necessarily something I learned from bikepacking, but these are 3 things that I've learned just about backpacking and bikepacking as I've gone through the years, and because I've done them wrong. So the first thing that I think you should do is make sure that everything's going to stay dry that needs to stay dry. So for instance, my sleeping bag is the number one thing. So I actually put it in a plastic bag, like a trash bag, no matter what. Even if my bags are waterproof, even if it's separated from everything else, I still keep it in a plastic trash bag just to make sure. Just The worst thing on a cold day is to try to get into a wet sleeping bag, and so I always keep that in a bag. Same thing with my puffy jacket and things like that. The other thing, if you're new, this will be something that you'll have to work through, but grouping your items. It's a little bit hard with bike packing because you often will have like very small bags, so you can't keep the whole category in one bag. You sometimes need to split it in between two, but I try to have one bag that I take off my bike that has all my dry items in it, like my sleeping bag, and that way I can just have that bag ready, set up my tent, put that bag in my tent, and I have everything inside my tent that I need. That's not always realistic. It really depends on the size of your bags, but that is something that you'll figure out along the way. I also learned like to keep my food in one bag so that if I need to hang it for bears, I can just hang one bag and I don't have to like find all the food in all the little bags. So things like that are very helpful in the long run. And the last tip I have is if I'm going to be bikepacking in an area, I'll often do a little bit of research. Sometimes it's a week before, sometimes it's the day before, sometimes it's months before, but no matter what, if I find something that's like a possible campsite or a possible campground or a grocery store or whatever, I just pin it on Google Maps. That way, and I have a category for each trip, so you can name your category. So I'll just name it XWA, and then I know when I pull up XWA, it'll show me any camping or grocery stores or whatever the thing is that I pin, and I can see it on my map. I also save those maps offline always. So before you go on your trip, make sure you save that area offline, and that way you'll have all the information that you need. You can get a lot of this information from Rides with GPS. So if you find a route on Rides with GPS, a lot of times people will mark a lot of the POIs or the points of interest or waypoints or grocery stores. But if you do download that GPX onto your bike computer, it won't automatically have all that stuff on it. So, and also you may need to pay for that, and I don't have the paid version of Ride with GPS. So I've found that Google Maps is very helpful for just creating a category. And anytime I think I see something that I may need or that may be useful, I just put a pin in it and I have it on my map for later. So, all right, so that's all the logistics, tips, tricks, and information that I have about the Cross Washington bike trip for now. And if you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Also, if you've done this route before, feel free to add to anything that I missed. I don't know if you learned anything while you did your trip, or if there was anything that you found a little bit hard, or what was your favorite part about it. Also, if you're a new bike packer, feel free to ask any questions. And if you're a seasoned bike packer, please let me know what things that new bike packers should know about this route or about bikepacking in general. Thanks for watching, and I hope everyone has a great day and happy trails. So let's go talk about the Washington. So stay tuned. Here we go. We're going to talk about, so let's get started.